Hey guys, tonight we begin with a question that's often forgotten amid the chaos of tanks, trenches, and total war. We talk about D-Day, we talk about Iwo Jima, we talk about the bulge, the bombs, the bravery. But here's a question that never makes it into the history books. When a soldier crawled out of a foxhole at 0:30 rifle in hand, scared out of his mind, what did he have for breakfast, lunch, dinner, and more importantly, did it actually taste like food, or did it taste like war? Because here's the thing, nobody tells you about World War II. Before you could defeat Hitler, before you could storm a beach or liberate a village, you had to survive something far more terrifying than the enemy. You had to survive the rations. We're talking about a chocolate bar so hard it doubled as body armor, a can of meat that looked like a crime scene, and one single sheet of toilet paper for an entire day. Make it count. Tonight, we're opening the mess kits of history. From the K-ration to the D-ration, from spam to starvation, from the soldier who traded his last cigarette for a spoonful of jam, to the moment a hot meal meant more than any medal ever could. Before we dig in, take a second to hit that like button and subscribe, but only if you're the kind of person who wants to know what survival actually tastes like. And drop a comment. If you were a soldier back then, what's one food from today you'd trade your rifle for? Now turn off the lights, get comfortable, and let's talk about the fuel that won and almost lost the war. One terrible tin of mystery meat at a time, before a single shot was fired, before the first paratrooper jumped into the black nothing over Normandy, before a single tank rolled across the Polish plain, or a single plane screamed through the skies above Britain. Every army on Earth faced a problem so basic, so unglamorous, that history books barely mention it. How do you feed millions of men, scattered across entire continents, fighting in deserts, jungles, mountains, and frozen hellscapes, without accidentally killing them in the process? Because here's the thing, nobody tells you about total war. An army marches on its stomach, but that stomach has demands. It wants food that doesn't spoil after 3 days in a hot tank. Food that doesn't shatter teeth when bitten in sub-zero temperatures. Food that can survive being dropped in mud, packed in a sweaty backpack, and carried for weeks through conditions that would make a cockroach file a complaint. And if that food could also not actively attract every rat, insect, and hungry stray dog within a 5-mile radius, even better. This wasn't a culinary challenge. It was a logistical nightmare wrapped in a supply chain disaster, sprinkled with the quiet terror of dysentery. The people designing these rations weren't chefs. They weren't even cooks. They were chemists, factory managers, and bureaucrats, working from a checklist that had exactly 4 requirements: portable, non-perishable, calorie-dense, cheap. Flavor was a distant 5th priority, somewhere between won't explode if dropped and doesn't immediately cause mutiny. And so, from the laboratories of America to the factories of Germany, from the makeshift kitchens of the Soviet Union to the rice paddies of Japan, the food of World War II was born. Not born delicious, born functional, born to survive longer than the men who carried it. The Americans approached the problem like engineers. They measured calories, calculated shelf life, and packed everything into tidy little cardboard boxes that looked like they'd been designed by someone who had never actually tried to open one with frozen fingers and no knife. The Germans started with confidence, sending their soldiers into battle with real sausages, real bread, real butter. Because in 1939, the Reich believed the war would be short and victory would be sweet. The British, ever practical, built their rations around the one thing that could keep an empire together through chaos and calamity: tea. Hot, strong, and available at all costs. The Soviets looked at their vast, frozen, supply-starved front lines and shrugged. Give them cabbage, give them black bread, give them something hot. Even if it's just water with a memory of vegetables, they'll fight anyway. They always do. The Japanese, with their supply lines stretched across the Pacific like spider silk in a hurricane, asked their soldiers to travel light, move fast, and survive on rice balls and sheer spiritual endurance. But here's what none of the planners anticipated. Food isn't just fuel, it's morale. A hot meal on a cold night can make a soldier believe he might actually survive this war. A cold tin of greasy mystery meat, eaten in the rain while shells land somewhere in the fog, can break something inside a man that never quite heals. Soldiers developed genuine attachments to certain rations. They also developed hatreds that lasted decades. Men who survived the war swore they'd never touch Spam again, never look at a cracker without flinching, never forget the taste of chocolate that doubled as a weapon. And while the generals debated strategy in heated rooms far from the front, the privates in the mud were trading cigarettes for jam, bartering chocolate for bread, and praying that the next supply truck brought something, anything, that didn't taste like the cardboard it came in. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. When you strip away the patriotism, the propaganda, the speeches about freedom and sacrifice, what remains is this. A 20-year-old kid from Ohio, or a conscript from Bavaria, or a farmer from Siberia, sitting in a hole in the ground, trying to open a can with a bayonet, wondering if the grey lump inside is beef or pork or something that never had a name. And if he's lucky, really lucky, there might be a cigarette afterward, or a piece of gum, or even better, a letter from home tucked into the ration box by some stranger who wanted him to know that someone, somewhere, was thinking about him. That's what the war tasted like. Not glory, not victory. Just a can of something, opened in the dark, shared with men whose names you'd forget, and whose faces you'd carry forever. And that single sheet of toilet paper, the one they packed into every K-ration like a cruel joke? You learned to make it count. You always made it count. Because in war, the small mercies are the only ones you can trust. And the meal you're eating right now might be the last one you ever get. But let's get specific. Let's put you in the mud. You're a 19-year-old American kid from Ohio, or maybe Texas, or maybe a neighborhood in Brooklyn that already feels like a different planet. You've been in country for 3 weeks, which is long enough to lose the novelty, but not long enough to lose the fear. You've marched 12 miles with 60 pounds of gear strapped to your back, through rain that soaks through everything, through mud that tries to swallow your boots whole. You've been shot at. Not just once, not just twice. Enough times that the crack of a rifle no longer makes you jump, just makes you duck instinctively, like a dog that's been kicked too many times. You haven't seen a proper bathroom in so long, you've stopped caring. You've stopped hoping. Your stomach makes sounds that could register on a seismograph, sounds that echo in your own ears and remind you that somewhere deep inside, your body is still running, still demanding fuel, still refusing to give up, even when your brain has already started making peace with the idea of dying in this hole. And then finally, you get to sit. You find a spot against a tree, or a chunk of wall, or just the damp earth, and you reach into your pack. You pull out a cardboard box about the size of a brick. It's beat up, corners crushed, slightly damp, but intact. This is your K-ration, designed by scientists who clearly never had to eat one. Packed by factory workers who probably went home to hot meals every night. Sealed in wax and hope and delivered to you here in the mud. Because somewhere in Washington, someone decided this was what victory tasted like. You open the box. Breakfast. Inside, a small can labeled ham and eggs. You learn quickly not to trust labels. What's inside is neither hammy nor eggy. It's a pale, spongy substance with the texture of something that should not exist in nature. It tastes like metal and memory, and something vaguely meat-adjacent that you can't quite identify. Next to it, a packet of crackers. These are not crackers in any civilian sense. These are hardtack's younger, meaner cousins, designed to survive a nuclear blast, designed to give your jaw a workout, designed to make you appreciate the ham and eggs by comparison. There's instant coffee, which is more instant than coffee, a powder that turns warm water into brown liquid that technically resembles coffee if you've never had coffee before and have no expectations. There's powdered lemonade, because someone in logistics thought soldiers fighting for their lives might appreciate a little citrus. There's a stick of gum, 4 cigarettes, and 1 single square of toilet paper. 1. For the entire day, you stare at it. You try not to think about what the next 24 hours will demand from that tiny square of paper. You fail. Lunch is not better. Lunch is cheese spread, which contains more chemicals than cheese, and another stack of crackers that have somehow gotten harder since breakfast. There might be a chocolate bar, but not the good kind. Not the Hershey's you remember from home. This is the D-ration chocolate, engineered to survive the apocalypse, dense as a brick, flavorless as cardboard, but technically chocolate in the same way that a parking lot is technically land. Dinner brings meat and beans, which looks exactly like what you'd imagine a crime scene looks like in a can. Brown, congealed, mysterious. With it, more crackers, more gum, and if you're very lucky, a tiny fruit bar that tastes like someone whispered the word apple over a piece of compressed sawdust. But here's the thing. Despite the taste, despite the texture, despite the existential despair of eating something called ham and eggs that contains no recognizable ham and no recognizable eggs, the K-ration works. 3,000 calories packed into that little cardboard brick. Enough protein to keep your muscles from eating themselves. Enough fat to keep your brain from shutting down. Enough sugar to keep you moving when moving means the difference between life and death. Soldiers become experts in ration economics. They trade like prisoners in a yard. Cigarettes for chocolate, cheese for crackers, anything to avoid the ham puck. Anything to get one more hit of something that doesn't taste like the box it came in. You learn which components to hoard, which to barter, which to bury in the bottom of your pack as emergency rations for a day, so bad that even the ham starts looking edible. And every now and then, just often enough to keep you hoping, you find a real Hershey bar. Not the D-ration brick. The real thing. Smooth, sweet, familiar. For one bite, you're not in a foxhole. You're not getting shot at. You're not listening to your friend cough in his sleep and wonder if he'll make it through the night. You're back home. You're at a soda fountain. You're a kid again before any of this happened. And that one bite makes the rest of it almost worth tolerating. Almost. But let's talk about that other chocolate bar. The one that wasn't a comfort. The one that was a trick. If the K-ration was the Army's attempt at a complete meal, the D-ration was something else entirely. Something darker. Something that looked like a gift, but functioned like a weapon. It came wrapped in brown paper, stamped with military markings, roughly the size of a deck of cards. It looked like chocolate. It felt like chocolate. It even smelled vaguely like chocolate, if you held it close enough and really used your imagination. But the moment you bit into it, you understood. This was not chocolate. This was punishment disguised as dessert. This was a survival tool wearing the skin of a candy bar. The D-ration was engineered in coordination with the US Army to do exactly 3 things. 1. Not melt. Not in the South Pacific heat. Not in the North African sun. Not in the pocket of a soldier who'd been marching for hours through temperatures that could fry an egg on a tank hole. 2. Last forever. Literally forever. Or at least long enough that the war would end before the rations did. 3. Taste so unappealing that soldiers would only eat it if they were literally starving to death. The military asked for that. They requested it be unappetizing. They wanted a chocolate bar that men would avoid until they had no other choice. And the Hershey Company, bless their patriotic hearts, delivered beyond anyone's expectations. What they created was a brown brick with the density of granite and the flavor profile of boiled despair. The ingredients were technically food: chocolate liquor, sugar, cocoa butter, oat flour. But the proportions were wrong. The processing was wrong. The result was a bar so hard that biting into it without warming it first could result in a dental emergency serious enough to send you to the rear lines. Soldiers reported that the bar could double as a hammer in a pinch. Some swore they'd used them as tent stakes. Others claimed they'd traded them to local civilians who mistook them for construction materials. One private famously wrote home that he'd tried to melt his D-ration in boiling water for 20 minutes and emerged with a brick that was now slightly warm but otherwise unchanged, like some kind of edible Terminator that refused to die. But here's the dark genius behind it all. The D-ration worked. It did exactly what it was designed to do. 600 calories packed into that little brick. 600 calories that could survive airdrops, jungle rot, monsoon rains, and the digestive system of a desperate rat. If you were trapped behind enemy lines, cut off from supply, hiding in a ditch with nothing but your rifle and the contents of your pockets, that terrible chocolate brick might be the only thing standing between you and starvation. It wouldn't comfort you. It wouldn't remind you of home. It wouldn't give you that warm, nostalgic feeling that real chocolate gave. But it would keep your heart beating for another 24 hours. It would give you just enough energy to keep moving, keep hiding, keep fighting. The soldiers understood this eventually. They made jokes about it, because that's what soldiers do with horror. They called it the anti-chocolate bar. They said it tasted like ground-up ration boxes mixed with regret. They invented elaborate stories about how the army was testing it as a potential armor plating for vehicles. But when things got really bad, when the supply lines snapped and the food stopped coming, and the only thing left in your pack was that brown brick of misery, you ate it. You softened it against your skin, inside your shirt, close to your heartbeat, until it gave just enough to bite. You chewed slowly, deliberately, because chewing too fast was a recipe for a cracked molar and a new kind of agony. And you swallowed, and you felt it hit your stomach like a rock, dense and heavy, and somehow sustaining. There were rumors, never confirmed, that some soldiers used the D-ration to barter with the enemy. Not for food, but for information, for safe passage, for a moment of peace in a war that offered none. Because even the Germans, even the Japanese, even the most hardened enemy soldiers knew what that brown brick represented. It meant the American was desperate. It meant the American had nothing left but this terrible chocolate and the will to keep going. And sometimes, just sometimes, that was enough to make the other side look away. The D-ration wasn't comfort food. It wasn't even really food. It was a message from the factory to the foxhole. We know you're suffering. We can't make it stop. But we can make sure you suffer a little longer. And in war, longer is everything. Longer means you might see tomorrow. Longer means you might get back home. Longer means that terrible chocolate brick, that edible insult, that 600 calories of pure survival did its job. You hated it. You'd always hate it, but you couldn't deny that it kept you alive. And sometimes, in the dark, when the shells were falling and the fear was rising and there was nothing else in your pack but that brown paper wrapper, alive was the only thing worth being. But the K-ration was survival. The D-ration was punishment. And then there was something else. Something that made men weep with gratitude and curse with frustration in almost the same breath. The field kitchen. Rolling misery carts, the soldiers called them. Mobile food units pulled behind trucks or horses, staffed by cooks who had somehow avoided the front lines and now spent their days performing a kind of alchemy that bordered on witchcraft. Because what those cooks did, with government-issued cans and 50-gallon pots and spices that probably predated the war, was nothing short of miraculous. They turned rations into meals. They turned survival into something that almost resembled living. The field kitchen was announced not by sound, but by smell. That smell. The one that traveled faster than any messenger, that cut through the fog of war and reached men huddled in foxholes a mile away. Wood smoke and coffee and something cooking, something hot, something that hadn't come out of a cardboard box. Soldiers would lift their heads like dogs catching a scent on the wind. They would start moving before any order came. Because when that smell reached you, it meant food was coming. Real food, hot food, food that hadn't been designed by a committee of chemists in a laboratory far from any battlefield. The kitchen itself was a sight to behold. A truck or a trailer converted into a mobile cafeteria. Giant pots bubbling over wood fires, steam rising into the air like incense at some strange battlefield mass. Cooks in stained aprons wielding ladles the size of small shovels, moving with the efficiency of men who had done this 1,000 times and would do it 1,000 more, and lined up in front of them, stretching back into the trees or the mud or the bombed-out ruins of some village, the soldiers, waiting, patient in a way they never were for anything else, because this was worth waiting for. You'd approach with your mess kit, that metal tray that folded into itself like some kind of engineering puzzle, always slightly greasy, always slightly dented, always smelling faintly of whatever had been eaten from it last week. You'd hold it out like a beggar at a monastery door, and the cook would ladle something onto it, something brown and steaming, something that might be stew, or might be slop, or might be the best thing you'd ever tasted, depending entirely on how long it had been since your last hot meal. In Europe, it might be creamed chipped beef on toast, a dish the soldiers renamed with 2 words that cannot be repeated here, but that captured exactly how they felt about it. In the Pacific, it might be rice and something vaguely meat floating in broth. In North Africa, it might be something with beans and tomatoes, and a hint of something almost like spice. It didn't matter what it was. It was hot. It was cooked. It was served by someone who wasn't trying to kill you. And then there was the coffee. The coffee was sacred. Brewed in quantities large enough to float a small boat, strong enough to strip paint, bitter enough to make a medic's morphine seem sweet by comparison. Soldiers drank it black because there was no milk. They drank it scalding because there was no time to let it cool. They drank it in rain and snow and desert heat, cupping their metal mugs with both hands like they were holding something precious, something that connected them to the world before all this. A sergeant in Italy wrote home that he'd trade a week's rations for 1 cup of his mother's coffee, but that this army stuff, this thick black sludge they served from those giant urns, this was the only thing keeping him sane. Because coffee meant normal. Coffee meant morning. Coffee meant that somewhere, beyond the shells and the mud and the dead, the world still turned. You ate standing up, usually, or squatting, or sitting on a rock or a helmet, or the body of a destroyed tank. There were no tables. There were no chairs. There was no conversation beyond the basic grunts of men focused entirely on the task of getting food from tray to mouth. But there was something else. There was silence. Not the silence of fear or ambush or waiting for death. Just silence. The silence of men eating. For 5 minutes, 10, if you were lucky, you weren't a soldier. You weren't a target. You were just a person having a meal. The shells could be falling a mile away. The dead could be waiting to be counted. The war could be pressing in from all sides. But here, with this metal tray and this hot food and this bitter coffee, you were human again. And that small act of humanity, that brief return to normal life, was worth more than any medal. It was worth more than the general speeches or the newspapers' headlines, or the flag they'd wrap you in if you didn't make it. It was a reminder that you were still alive, still here, still fighting, still hoping that someday, somehow, you'd eat a meal like this at a real table, with real people, in a world that had forgotten what war tasted like. But for now, this was enough. This hot food, this bitter coffee, this moment of peace in the endless storm. This was enough to keep you going. This was enough to make you believe that tomorrow might be better. And in war, belief is everything. But the field kitchen was the exception, not the rule. The real story of World War II food, the story they don't tell in the documentaries or the museum exhibits, is what happened when the kitchens didn't show up. When the supply lines snapped. When the trucks got bombed, or the boats got sunk, or the weather simply refused to cooperate. Because that happened. A lot. And when it did, soldiers learned something that no training manual could teach. They learned that when you're hungry enough, when your stomach has been empty for days, and your body has started eating itself just to keep your heart beating, anything becomes food. Anything. This is where the war got weird. This is where the history books get quiet. Because the things soldiers ate when official rations ran out, the things they did to survive, those aren't the stories they told at veterans' dinners. Those are the stories they whispered to each other decades later, late at night, when the whiskey had loosened their tongues and the memories had softened just enough to speak. In the Pacific, on islands where supply ships never arrived, and Japanese soldiers were cut off for months, men ate things that would make you vomit just to hear about them. Tree bark, boiled until it softened into something that could technically be chewed. Roots dug from the jungle floor, some of which turned out to be poisonous, some of which turned out to be barely edible, all of which were eaten anyway because the alternative was worse. Lizards, caught with bare hands and eaten raw because starting a fire might attract enemy patrols. Insects, grubs, rats. The same rats that had been stealing what little rice remained became the rats that were caught and cooked and divided into portions so small they barely qualified as a mouthful. Soldiers wrote in their diaries about the taste of things they'd never imagined eating. They wrote about the guilt, the shame, the primal relief of finding something, anything, that could keep them alive another day. On the Eastern Front, where winter was an enemy as deadly as any German, Soviet soldiers became experts in the art of making nothing into something. They boiled boot leather, not as a joke, not as a story to tell later, but as a genuine attempt to extract calories from things that were never meant to be food. They scraped the mold off abandoned bread and ate what was underneath. They melted snow in their helmets and called it soup. They traded everything they had for a single potato, a handful of grain, a piece of salt pork, so old it had probably been packed before the revolution. One soldier wrote home that he'd learned to appreciate the taste of his own hunger, the way it hollowed him out and made everything else irrelevant. He said hunger was the only thing he could count on. Hunger was the one promise the war always kept. In North Africa, where the heat could spoil food in hours and the flies could carry away what the heat didn't destroy, British and American troops discovered the strange economy of desperation. Cigarettes became currency. A pack of smokes could buy you a loaf of bread from a local merchant. A chocolate bar could buy you information about enemy positions. A tin of meat could buy you a night in a real bed, with real sheets, in a house where nobody was shooting. Soldiers became traders, hagglers, scavengers. They learned which villages were friendly and which would rob you blind. They learned which local foods were safe and which would put you in the hospital with dysentery so violent you'd beg for the bullet you'd been dodging. And then there were the rumors. The stories that never made it into official reports, but circulated through every army, every front, every language. Stories of soldiers so desperate, so far beyond the edge of human endurance, that they crossed lines that can never be uncrossed. Stories from Stalingrad, where the winter of 1942 turned a city into a tomb, and the living had to make choices that haunted them until their own dying days. Stories from the Pacific, where isolated garrisons ran out of everything except each other. These stories were never confirmed. They were never denied. They just existed, whispered in the dark. A reminder that war doesn't just kill you. War can change you into something you wouldn't recognize. War can make you do things that can never be undone. Most soldiers never crossed that line. Most soldiers found other ways. They shared what little they had. They pooled their resources, combined their rations, created communal meals that stretched every calorie to its absolute limit. They invented recipes born of pure desperation. The Americans called it trench stew. Whatever anyone had, dumped into a helmet and heated over a tiny fire, stirred with a bayonet, divided by however many men were left to eat it. The British called it compo stew, after the composite rations they received, and they ate it with the same stoic acceptance they brought to everything else. The Germans, reduced from sausages and bread to boiled turnips and ersatz coffee, called it hunger soup and drank it slowly, trying to make it last. And through it all, through the starvation and the improvisation and the things they'd rather forget, they kept fighting. Not because the food was good, not because they believed in their cause or their country or their generals. They kept fighting because the alternative was worse. Because stopping meant dying. Because as long as there was another meal to find, another day to survive, another chance to make it home, they would keep going. They would eat the rats and the roots and the boot leather. They would trade their last cigarette for a handful of grain. They would share their final tin with a stranger who'd become a brother. And when the war finally ended, when they came home and sat down at real tables with real food and real families, they would eat in silence. They would chew slowly. They would remember. And they would never, ever take a single bite for granted again. Because they knew what the rest of us have never learned. They knew what it means to be hungry enough to eat anything. They knew what it means to survive when survival seems impossible. And that knowledge, that dark and terrible knowledge, is the real ration they brought home from the war. It never spoiled. It never ran out. It never let them forget.